I lost everything. My home, my savings, my last chance at happiness. After my wife's death, I lived in the house I had built with my own hands. I thought my heart would never again respond to another's touch. But one day, my granddaughter convinced me to sign up for a dating site. That's where I met her. Her words about eternal love warmed me more than any fireplace. I sold the house for a new life by her side. But on the FBI's wanted website, I saw her photograph. The woman of my dreams turned out to be a wanted woman. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The silence in the house was a physical presence. It didn't just exist. It had weight, a density that settled over every surface, every shadow. This old house in Seattle, a place once brimming with laughter and the easy rhythm of two lives lived in parallel, had become both my sanctuary and my prison. I was an 80-year-old widower, a man named Arthur Hayes, and my loneliness was a companion more constant than any human could be. My wife Elizabeth had been gone for 2 years, and with each passing month, her absence solidified, no longer a mere void, but a heavy, tangible burden. Every creak of the floorboards, every shaft of sunlight cutting through the dust-mote-filled air felt like a cruel mockery of the life we had once shared. I had been a detective of financial crimes, a man who built his career on an unwavering belief in order and logic, on finding the minuscule imperfections in the grand, elaborate schemes of fraudsters. I was used to seeing the world in stark black and white, where every fact had its place, and every lie its traceable origin. But none of my skills, none of my methodical approach could protect me from this all-consuming emptiness. My granddaughter Lily would visit on weekends. She was young and full of life, and her presence was so bright, so loud, that it only served to emphasize the profound quiet that would return after she left. "Grandpa, you have to move on," she would say, and I would nod, but I remained rooted. She was my only remaining anchor to the world, and I knew she did what she did out of a love so fierce it bordered on desperation. But I felt like an old tree. Its roots sunk too deeply into the same worn-out ground. My world was a small one, made up of old books, the smell of coffee in the mornings, and a collection of memories I would meticulously sort through, like old coins. On one particular visit, she arrived with a laptop. Her eyes, so full of that youthful determination, sparkled. "I created a profile for you," she said, and I felt my heart seize with a familiar dread. I felt like an exhibit in a museum, the last of a dying species, put on display for public consumption. I was not a man of the digital age. My world was analog. I was accustomed to handshakes, to reading a person's character in their eyes, to the way a voice would rise or fall with a change in emotion. It was all about the tangible. But on a screen, none of that was possible. It was all a curated facade, a performance. I had spent a lifetime looking past such facades, and the idea of creating one for myself was unsettling. She began to ask me questions. "What are your hobbies?" she asked. I thought of my past as a survival instructor, of how I spent my days now meticulously reviewing old maps and geological charts. I thought of my love for classical music, of the quiet hours spent simply observing the world from my study window. I was a man who saw the details, who understood the world through its small, subtle nuances. But how could I explain that in a few words? How could I distill the complexity of a lifetime into an online profile designed for quick, superficial judgments? I felt my entire being simplified, reduced to a handful of bland, generic phrases. I was a man of the mountains and the city's hidden alleys, not a collection of digital tags. Lily was patient. She helped me select a photograph. We went through hundreds of them, and with each one I felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over me. I saw my old, wrinkled face, the deep-set lines around my eyes, the silver in my hair, and I could not fathom that anyone would want to look at it. She chose a picture of me from my 80th birthday, one where I was smiling. I barely remembered that moment, but she insisted that it made me look happy. I looked at myself in the reflection of the screen and did not recognize the man staring back. It was not me. It was an image crafted to attract attention, to sell a narrative I no longer believed in. I felt a sense of profound unease. When she was finished, she turned the laptop to me. My name, my age, my photograph, and a short, soulless description of my life. I stared at it, and a profound sense of fear settled in my chest. This was not my reflection. It was a distorted, simplified image of my soul, a digital ghost created to be easily understood by strangers. It felt alien. I closed the laptop. The digital world vanished, and I was back in my old, familiar one. The world where there were no bright screens, but only the shadows that seemed so familiar, so comforting. I felt like an exhibit in a museum, the last of a dying species. I returned to my armchair, and the emptiness I had fought for so long reclaimed me. I closed my eyes and felt a familiar ache in my chest. I thought of Elizabeth. I remembered the sound of her laugh, the way she would look at me when she was lost in thought, the warmth of her hand in mine. I knew that I was supposed to move on, but I did not know what that meant. I was a man who was used to having control, who could find the logic in any situation, no matter how complex. But loneliness was like chaos. It was faceless, and it was without mercy. I sat in the silence, listening to the sounds of the old house, the creak of the floorboards, the wind rattling the window panes, the steady tick of the grandfather clock. I felt my heart beating, and it was like a trapped bird. I knew I had to do something. I had to find a new path. But I did not know what that meant. I was a man who had lost his purpose. I was a man who had lost his way. I was a man who was willing to do anything to feel alive again. And I waited. I waited for something to change. But I did not know what it would be. I did not know it would be her. Her who would steal not only my money but my last chance at happiness. Her who would make me feel alive again, only to take it all away. Her who would force me to remember who I truly was, a detective, a hunter, a man who did not forgive. I closed mine eyes and pictured her face. I didn't know her yet, but I knew she would come. I felt it. I felt that my heart was finally beating again. I felt that I was finally beginning to live. But it wasn't a life. It was a hunt, and I was ready. I was a man of the analog world, and my granddaughter's digital creation felt like a portal to a foreign land. She had set up the profile, but it was I who had to confront the cold, impersonal interface. My fingers, accustomed to the crisp feel of a well-documented financial record, the satisfying click of an old typewriter, felt clumsy as they scrolled through a gallery of faces. Each one was a stranger's hope, their carefully curated photograph a silent plea for connection. I was a relic, an 80-year-old widower, and my cynicism was a heavy cloak, a familiar defense mechanism against the raw vulnerability I felt in this marketplace of lonely hearts. I saw the desperate smiles, the empty eyes, the obvious attempts to seem younger, wealthier, more vibrant than they were. I was a man who had spent a lifetime looking for the subtle cracks in a polished facade, and this entire world felt like a single, massive lie. I was about to close the laptop and retreat to my quiet world of books and memories when I saw her profile. Her name was Eleanor. Her photograph was not a glamour shot, but a simple, elegant portrait. It was a headshot, and her eyes held a kindness that seemed to radiate from the screen. She had a soft, genuine smile that made the lines around her eyes seem like a map of a life well lived. She was a widow, too. Her profile spoke of her love for quiet evenings, for classical music, for the simple pleasures that I, too, cherished. Our conversations began with a polite, almost formal exchange, but they quickly deepened. She spoke to me with a gentle, intelligent grace that was both disarming and profoundly comforting. I found myself waiting for her replies with a nervous anticipation I hadn't felt since my youth, a feeling that made my old heart beat with an unfamiliar rhythm. She had a way of making me feel seen, of truly seeing the man I was beneath the quiet, solitary exterior. She asked me about my past, about my work as a financial crimes detective, a profession that she found endlessly fascinating. She asked me about the loss of my wife, about the silence that had followed. She didn't pry. She simply listened, her words a balm for a wound that had never truly healed. She spoke of her own grief, of the difficult, winding journey of rebuilding a life after loss. In her, I found a kindred spirit, a soul who understood the crushing weight of loneliness. It was a connection that transcended the digital medium, a bridge built of shared experience and a mutual understanding of life's quiet tragedies. The house, which had felt like a tomb for so long, began to feel like a home again. I would sit by the window with a cup of coffee, the morning sunlight making the words on the screen glow, and I would feel a sense of peace I thought I had lost forever. She had rekindled a spark in a life I had thought was all but over. We decided to meet for coffee at a small, unassuming place downtown. The moment I saw her, my heart leaped. She was even more beautiful in person than in her photograph. Her smile reached her eyes, and her laugh was a melody that filled the space between us. Her hands, when she gestured, were graceful, and her voice was a soft, melodious sound that I found myself wanting to hear for hours. We talked for what felt like an eternity, the conversation flowing effortlessly from one topic to the next, a river of shared thoughts and experiences. I found myself lost in her presence, captivated by her charm and wit. I felt a sense of euphoria, a feeling that my life was beginning again, not just continuing. She was everything I had hoped for, and more. For the first time in years, I saw a future for myself, a life filled with companionship and warmth. As the evening wore on, a subtle, melancholy note entered her voice. She spoke of a charity she had founded, a small organization dedicated to helping orphaned children in a developing country. It was a beautiful cause, a testament to her giving nature, and her passion was clear. But she told me, with a note of genuine sadness, that they had hit a financial roadblock, a temporary funding gap that threatened to shut them down. A promised grant had been delayed, and they needed a bridge, she said, a temporary loan to get them through this difficult time. She explained it all with such earnestness, with such a heartfelt plea, that my analytical mind, the part of me that had spent a lifetime detecting scams, was completely disarmed. She spoke not of money, but of the children, of their smiles, of their hopes and dreams that would be crushed if she couldn't find a way to help them. My mind, which was once a fortress of logic and caution, was now a city in chaos. I told myself that this was different. This was not a con. This was a woman who was in need, a woman I had come to love. She had given me back my life, had filled the desolate landscape of my soul with light and laughter, and I felt a fierce, burning desire to help her, to be her hero. I thought of all the years I had spent alone, the long, empty evenings, and the sheer joy of her companionship. The money from the sale of my house was my last asset, my last chance at security. But what was security without happiness? What was a full bank account if my heart was empty? She promised me that we would be together forever, and I, a man who had only ever believed in hard facts and verifiable data, believed her. I was ready to sell my house, my last tangible connection to a past I no longer wanted, and give her every last cent. I was so convinced that this was my second chance that I willingly blinded myself to the glaring warning signs. My professional instincts, honed over a lifetime of rooting out deceit, were silenced by a heart that was desperate to believe. I was ready to make the ultimate sacrifice, to lay my last vestiges of security at her feet. I was not a victim. I was a man in love. And I was ready to do anything for her. The empty house was a shell of a memory, and I was a ghost within its walls. I had signed the papers in a whirlwind of emotional chaos, the crisp rustle of the legal documents a stark contrast to the quiet desperation in my heart. The notary's pen felt heavy in my hand, a tool of irreversible change. The buyers, a young family with bright, hopeful eyes, moved through the rooms with a reverence that felt like an insult. They saw a future here. I saw only the final act of my past. I watched as they measured spaces for furniture, their excited whispers a cruel counterpoint to the profound silence that had become my life. I was giving away my last tether to Elizabeth, to the life we had built. But Eleanor had promised a new one, a life of shared joy and companionship. I had traded the security of my past for the promise of a future, a foolish, desperate gamble. The transfer of funds was the final, unceremonious act of my great surrender. I sat at the kitchen table, the laptop a cold and sterile presence in a room that had once been the heart of my home. My fingers, accustomed to the methodical process of auditing and tracking money, hesitated for only a moment before typing the account number she had given me. It was a simple sequence of digits, a binary key to my life's savings. The click of the confirm button was not a sound, but a sensation, a final, unblinking punctuation mark on the end of a lifetime of work. My bank account, once a meticulous record of a lifetime of prudence, was now a ledger of my foolishness. The balance was gone, a staggering number reduced to 0. I did not feel a pang of regret. I felt a sense of profound liberation. I had laid my past at her feet. I had given her everything. She left that same afternoon. She stood in the driveway, the passenger door of her car open, the engine a low, impatient hum. She hugged me tightly, her voice a soft murmur of promises. "We'll be together forever, Arthur," she had said, her words a final, lyrical illusion. I watched her car pull away, a cloud of exhaust, a final fading sigh on the cool Seattle air. I stood there for a long time, the sun setting behind the familiar silhouette of the evergreen trees, my heart full of a breathless, dizzying hope. The house was empty now, but I was not alone. She would be back soon. The money would be a memory, and the future would be a new beginning. The first day was filled with a quiet, blissful anticipation. I felt as if I were in a dream. I woke up and the house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the promise of her return. I checked my phone, and there was a text from her, a simple, loving message. My heart soared. I was a man reborn. The second day was much the same. A few messages, a brief phone call. But by the third day, the messages became shorter, the calls less frequent. I told myself she was busy, that she was in a new city, that she had a lot of things to take care of. I made excuses for her, and for myself. My analytical mind, my lifetime of experience in understanding human behavior, was completely dormant. I was a man lost in a fog of misplaced trust, a stranger in my own skin. On the fifth day, the silence was total. I called her phone, and it went straight to voicemail. I sent her a message, and the checkmark remained gray, unread. My heart, which had been so full of hope, began to fill with a cold, creeping dread. I tried to tell myself that this was normal, that she would reach out when she could, but a deep primal fear had begun to claw its way up my throat. I sat at my computer, my hands shaking, and logged into my bank account. The screen was stark, a single number staring back at me. 0. The money was gone. The transfer had been successful, but the account she had given me was now closed, a digital ghost that had vanished into the ether. My professional instincts, which had been so dormant, were suddenly wide awake. The alarm bells were ringing, a cacophony of sirens in my mind. The humiliation was a physical presence. It was a hot, burning flush of shame that spread across my face. I, Arthur Hayes, the former financial crimes detective, the man who had built a career on identifying fraud, had been scammed. I had been a perfect mark, a textbook example of a romance scam victim. I had given everything away for a lie. The emotional pain was a crushing wave that threatened to drown me, a grief so profound that it made the loss of Elizabeth feel like a distant echo. I had not only lost my home and my savings, I had lost my last chance at happiness, a chance that had been dangled in front of me and then cruelly snatched away. The shame was suffocating. I felt like a fool, a pathetic old man whose heart had betrayed his mind. But then, the pain began to change. The humiliation hardened my heart, the tears dried up, and a new feeling, cold and sharp and precise, took their place. It was not anger. It was not rage. It was a quiet, relentless sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was a professional. My training, my entire life's work, had prepared me for this moment. I would not allow this woman to escape. I would not allow her to get away with what she had done. My heart was broken, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. She had left a digital trail, a financial footprint, a psychological pattern. She had left crumbs, and I was going to follow them, one by one, to their inevitable conclusion. The hunt was on. The victim was dead. In his place, a hunter emerged. My name was Arthur Hayes, and I was in a cheap motel room on the outskirts of Seattle, the kind of place where the air was thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and manufactured disinfectant. This was not the home I had sold, the place filled with ghosts of a life well lived. This was a temporary purgatory, and I was here for a single purpose: to find the woman who had stolen everything from me. My heart was a stone in my chest, and my mind, once lost in a fog of foolish love, was now a fortress of cold, analytical thought. I was a man of logic and facts, a former financial crimes detective, and this was not an act of vengeance. This was a return to the origins of who I was. My weapon of choice was not a gun, but a laptop, the same one my granddaughter had used to introduce me to the digital world that had so thoroughly undone me. The keyboard felt alien beneath my fingertips, but the purpose was not. I was back on the trail, and the clues were right in front of me, in the email account I had used to communicate with Eleanor. The old me would have just deleted everything, a futile attempt to erase the memory of my humiliation. The new me knew that every single word, every timestamp, every attachment was a piece of evidence. I began my work methodically, just as I had done with thousands of cases before. I created a new folder on my desktop, a digital crime scene labeled simply Eleanor. I started at the very beginning, with her first message. I didn't read it for its content, I read it for its metadata. I was looking for the invisible ink, the digital fingerprints left behind in every electronic communication. The time of day she sent it, the type of client she was using, the IP address from which it was sent. I knew that IP addresses were often masked or routed through proxies, but even a masked IP could tell you something. It could tell you the country of origin, the city, the type of service she was using. It was a breadcrumb, and I was a starving man. The pattern of her messages was a fascinating study. I had once seen them as the honest, heartfelt words of a kindred spirit. Now, I saw them for what they were: a script. I noticed how her messages would often mirror the topics I brought up. If I mentioned my love for classical music, she would respond with a newfound passion for Bach. If I spoke of my long, solitary walks in the park, her next message would describe a similar longing for nature. I had once taken this as a sign of deep compatibility. Now, I saw it for what it was: a classic technique of mirroring and manipulation, a way to build a false sense of shared identity. She wasn't a person, she was a persona, a collection of curated interests designed to exploit a lonely man's desperate desire for connection. I went back to the photographs she had sent me. I had once seen them as snapshots of her life. Now, I saw them as evidence. I used simple online tools to analyze their metadata. The cameras she claimed to have used were inconsistent. One photo, supposedly taken on her latest trip to Europe, had been shot with a high-end Canon, a camera she had never mentioned owning. The next photo, a selfie from a local coffee shop, had been taken with a much lower quality phone. The inconsistencies screamed at me, a silent, damning indictment of her deceit. I had been so blinded by hope that I had missed the most basic of clues, the kind of clues that would have immediately set off alarm bells in my old life. The feeling of shame was a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by a burning sense of purpose. I was an investigator, not a victim, and every single mistake she had made was a gift to me. I began to build a timeline, a meticulous record of our digital relationship. I charted every message, every phone call, every piece of information she had given me. I saw how she had slowly, incrementally, groomed me for the final con. The small, seemingly innocent questions about my life, my family, my financial situation. She had not just been making conversation, she had been conducting a professional audit of my vulnerabilities, a reconnaissance mission to find my soft spots. The fact that I had once been an auditor myself, a man who built a career on identifying such patterns, made the humiliation all the more profound. I was a professional marksman who had walked willingly into the firing range, believing the shooter was my friend. The most disturbing part of my investigation was the analysis of her language. I had once found her words so comforting, so genuine. Now I saw them as a tool. I ran her emails through simple text analysis software, looking for patterns, for the linguistic tics of a professional scammer. I saw how she used words like forever, soulmate, and destiny, words that were designed not to be believed, but to be felt, to bypass the rational mind and go straight to the desperate heart. Her vocabulary was a carefully selected arsenal of emotional weapons, each word chosen for its ability to disarm and disorient. My work in the motel room was a solitary, relentless pilgrimage back into the darkness. I had to go back into the very space where I had been betrayed, the digital world of our supposed romance, and strip it of its lies. I was looking for a single, undeniable link, a tiny, seemingly insignificant piece of data that would lead me to her real identity. I was not looking for Eleanor. I was looking for the real person behind the persona, the woman who had not only taken my money, but had also stolen my last chance at a life with a partner. I knew she wasn't alone. These operations were never the work of a single person. They were organized, systematic, and often involved a network of people, each with a specific role. I began to look for the connections between her profile and others. I scoured the internet for similar profiles, using the same language, the same type of photographs, the same story of a tragic past and a noble cause. I knew that they were like a pack of wolves, each one of them a hunter in the digital wilderness. And I knew that somewhere, in the vast interconnected world of the internet, they had made a mistake. A single careless mistake that would lead me to them. The nights blurred into days. The air in the room grew heavy and still. I did not sleep. I did not eat. I was a man on a mission, a ghost in a motel, and my only companion was the glow of the laptop screen, a source of both my humiliation and my redemption. I was going to find them. I would not rest until I had seen their faces, until I had understood the full extent of their deceit. They thought they had left me with nothing. They were wrong. They had left me with my mind, my skills, and a cold, unforgiving sense of purpose. And that was all I needed. The hunt was on. My hands were a blur of motion across the cold keys of the laptop. The motel room had become a sterile laboratory, and my subject was the woman I had once believed to be my salvation. I was no longer a lovesick fool. I was a detective once more, my target's name not a term of endearment, but a case file. I had every email, every photo, every fleeting text message she had ever sent me saved in a single, meticulously organized folder. My mind, once clouded by her charm, was now a razor-sharp instrument, dissecting every word, every phrase, every subtle emotional shift in our correspondence. I began by categorizing her communication. I created subfolders with labels that felt clinical and detached. Initial contact, relationship building, vulnerability mining, and the ask. I saw the stages of the con laid bare, a playbook as old as deception itself. The initial messages were broad and non-committal, fishing for common interests. I had once seen these as a genuine attempt at connection, but now I saw them as a data-gathering exercise. She would mention a general love for art or music and wait to see what I would latch onto. When I responded about my appreciation for classical composers, her next email was filled with references to Brahms and Chopin. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated mirroring technique, a fundamental tool of the con artist. She wasn't a classical music enthusiast. She was a performer. I moved on to a deeper level of analysis. I opened a separate document and began to compile a list of her most frequently used phrases. Words like soulmate, destiny, and meant to be appeared with a chilling regularity. I had once believed them to be the spontaneous expressions of a woman in love. Now I saw them for what they were: emotional triggers, designed to bypass my rational mind and appeal directly to my loneliness and my desperate hope for a second chance. She had played me like a cello, each word a carefully selected note, building to a crescendo of trust. I found myself remembering the exact moment she had used each phrase, the way they had resonated with a part of me that had been dormant for so long. She had not been in love with me. She had been in love with the idea of what she could get from me. My focus shifted from her words to her psychological profile. I had spent decades studying the criminal mind, understanding the motivations behind fraud. This was different. This was not about spreadsheets and false ledgers. This was about the human heart. I saw how she had so skillfully exploited my deepest vulnerabilities, my loneliness, my grief over Elizabeth's death, my sense of being a man out of time. She had asked questions that seemed innocent on the surface, but were in fact probing for my soft spots. She had asked about Elizabeth, about the last time I had felt truly happy, about my relationship with my family. She had used that information to build a detailed psychological blueprint of my emotional landscape. She had not only stolen my money, she had stolen my trust in human connection, a far more devastating crime. The shame of my own foolishness was a constant burning presence, but it was also a source of fuel. I had been so convinced that her empathy was genuine. I had believed her because she had seemed to understand my pain. Now I saw that her empathy was a performance, a tool used to lull me into a state of emotional vulnerability. She had studied me, just as I had once studied the marks of a con artist. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I had spent my life as a hunter, and I had become the prey. The old me would have been paralyzed by this humiliation. The new me was driven by it. My emotional pain had been transmuted into a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just a case. This was a dissection of my own failure. As I dug deeper, I began to see that the Eleanor who had charmed me was not a single isolated fraudster. I started looking for other victims, searching for similar patterns on online forums and social media. I searched for her pictures, her phrases, her story. I found a string of other profiles, all using similar language, similar photographs, and similar sob stories. They were all widowed, all charming, all in need of a financial bridge for a noble cause. I saw a system, a network of predators, and I was just one of many marks they had fleeced. I was a single data point in a vast, sprawling criminal enterprise. The realization was a shock, but it also freed me from the weight of personal humiliation. It wasn't just my foolishness. It was a professional, systematic operation. I began to compile a dossier, not just on Eleanor, but on the entire criminal network. I cross-referenced the names she had given me, the locations she had mentioned, the details of her life that she had so carefully fabricated. I saw how she had used fake names, stolen photographs, and a web of lies to create a fictional persona. My work, which had once been about finding a person and their motive, was now about deconstructing a phantom. It was like hunting a ghost, a specter that had no real existence, only a digital footprint. I knew that she would not be the only one. There had to be an organizer, a mastermind behind the scenes, someone who provided the script, the photographs, the fake personas. I was looking for the architect of the lie, the person who had orchestrated the entire operation. My goal was no longer simply to find Eleanor. It was to dismantle the entire network that had victimized not only me, but countless other lonely, unsuspecting people. The cold rage that had consumed me after the con was now a fuel for a more calculated and methodical hunt. I was a man of logic and order, and I was going to bring order to this chaos. I would find them, and I would make them pay. A sudden gust of wind rattled the single-paned window of my motel room, pulling me back from the precipice of a digital abyss. My eyes, weary from hours of staring at the cold glow of the laptop screen, felt gritty. I leaned back in the creaking plastic chair, the sterile scent of the disinfectant and the stale air a stark contrast to the familiar scent of old paper and leather-bound books that had filled my study. The files of Eleanor were closed for a moment, and my mind, an old machine that had been pushed to its limits, offered me a different file, a memory from a lifetime ago. A case I had worked, a case that had defined my philosophy as a detective, a case I had to remember now, not just as a past success, but as a blueprint for my future. I was in my late 50s, a man who believed in the tangible. The case was known as the cascade layering, a series of transactions so complex and so well hidden that they seemed to defy logic. The man behind it, a young, arrogant financier named Sterling, had created a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and encrypted digital ledgers. The money was being funneled from a dozen different sources, passed through a dozen different fake companies, and then vanished into the global financial system. The police had a paper trail, but it was a ghost trail. Every time they thought they had a lead, they hit a dead end. Every company was a lie. Every name was an alias. The trail went cold again and again, and the frustration in the precinct was a palpable, simmering rage. My colleagues, men who relied on muscle and aggression, saw a wall. They wanted to kick down doors, to interrogate witnesses, to find a smoking gun. I saw a system. I had always been the quiet one, the man who sat in a room with stacks of ledgers and documents, looking for the human element. My power was not in physical force, but in a quiet, unwavering patience. I trusted data. I believed that every system, no matter how perfect its design, was built by an imperfect person. And an imperfect person, no matter how careful, would always leave a trace. I sat in a tiny office, filled with stacks of printouts, and I began to do what I did best. I looked for the flaw. I did not look for the big things. I did not look for the fraudulent ledgers or the falsified tax documents. I looked for the small, almost microscopic details that a mind obsessed with the grand design would overlook. I spent weeks sorting through thousands of pages of transactions. I didn't care about the numbers. I cared about the inconsistencies, the handwriting on a signature, the specific font used on a document, the time and date stamp on a fax. I was looking for a pattern, a recurring unconscious habit that would betray the human behind the facade. It was a slow, agonizing process. My colleagues would laugh, calling my work a fool's errand, but I was not deterred. I was a man of principles, and my principle was simple. The truth is always there. You just have to be patient enough to find it. I would sit in the silence, the only sound the rustle of paper and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, and I would feel my mind working, connecting the tiny, disparate dots. It was a meditative state, a kind of quiet, spiritual communion with the data. I was not looking for a criminal. I was looking for a person. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was looking at a series of faxes sent from a dozen different shell companies. They all seemed flawless. The documents were all in different formats. The names were all different. The companies had no visible connection. But I noticed something. On every single document, the word receive was consistently misspelled as receive. A small insignificant typo, a simple mistake that would be easily overlooked by a human eye, scanning for larger issues. But a computer would see it. I cross-referenced the documents, and I found it. Every single fax, every single communication, no matter the name on the letterhead, had the same identical misspelling. It was a ghost in the machine, a digital fingerprint left by a careless hand. I knew I had him, but I needed more. The misspelling was not a crime, but it was a link. I then began to look for the other small details that would confirm my theory. I went back to the original documents from the first fake company. I looked at every piece of data. The phone number on the letterhead was a throwaway, a prepaid number that would lead to a dead end. But in the fine print of the last page, buried in the legal jargon of the company's registration, was a different number. A number for a certified courier. I called the number. It was disconnected, but I had a hunch. I ran the number through a series of databases. It had been used once before, over a year ago, to register a personal account with a shipping company. The address on the registration was a residential one, an apartment building in downtown Seattle. A detail so small, so seemingly meaningless, that it could only have been left by a person who was so confident in their scheme that they had forgotten the most basic rules of their own game. I found Sterling's home. The police found him there, surrounded by his empty computers, his digital empire reduced to nothing. He looked at me with a mix of shock and confusion. He had created a perfect crime, and I had found him because of a single forgotten phone number and a simple typo. My colleagues were amazed. They called me a genius. I was not a genius. I was a professional. I had simply done what I had always done. I had looked past the grand scheme and found the human flaw at its heart. The memory, so vivid and so real, receded back into the shadows of my mind. The glare of the laptop screen returned, and I looked at the files of Eleanor. My humiliation had been a blinding fog, but now, a new clarity filled me. She had created a beautiful, convincing lie, a perfect emotional trap. But she too was a person. She was not a machine. She had been so focused on the emotional manipulation, on the grand performance, that she must have overlooked a detail, a small, insignificant flaw in her digital persona. A single careless mistake that would lead me to her and to the people who controlled her. The past was not just a memory. It was a blueprint. My shame was a ghost. My purpose was a living, breathing thing. And the hunt was on. The motel room had become a crypt of my former life, a stark antiseptic space where I performed the digital autopsy of a fraud. I had spent days with my head bowed over the laptop, a digital archaeologist sifting through the rubble of a relationship that never was. My mind, once a fortress of logical thought, had been so thoroughly breached by Eleanor's charm that I had missed the most basic clues. The shame of that failure was a constant, burning presence, but I had learned to channel it, to use its heat to power my relentless search. My focus now was not on the emotional scars, but on the cold, hard, unfeeling truth of the money. Money, in my world, always left a trail. My initial investigation had been an exercise in deconstructing a phantom, a digital ghost. I had analyzed her persona, her words, her photographs, but a new phase of the hunt had begun. The money I had transferred, the last vestiges of my life's work, had to go somewhere. The bank she had given me for the transaction was the only solid, verifiable fact in a sea of lies. I had a name, a routing number, and an account number. This was my compass in the labyrinth. The bank was a small regional institution, the kind of place that prided itself on community ties and personal service. It was located on a quiet street in a suburb of Seattle, far from the financial districts of the city. I was not a man who could simply walk in and demand answers. I had been a financial detective, not a street cop. My methods were always quiet, always discreet. I needed to understand the environment before I could even consider my next move. I drove my old sedan to the area, a vehicle so unassuming that it blended seamlessly into the scenery. I parked in a lot across the street, a spot with a clear view of the bank's entrance. The rain was a constant, monotonous drizzle, a fitting soundtrack for my vigil. I sat in my car, a thermos of black coffee at my side, and began my observation. This was the work I had always been good at. I was a professional at being a ghost, a man who could watch and wait without ever being seen. My eyes, though 80 years old, were still sharp, still capable of seeing the small human details that others would miss. The bank had a small staff, only 3 or 4 tellers, a loan officer, and a manager who would occasionally emerge from his office. I watched them all. I watched their habits, their interactions, the way they moved through their day. I saw the tellers greet customers with practiced smiles. I saw the manager, a portly man with thinning hair, leave for lunch at the same time every day, a large umbrella shielding him from the rain. I saw the small, mundane rhythms of their lives, and I was looking for a single, discordant note. Then I saw him. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his late 20s, and he sat at a desk in the back corner, away from the constant flow of customers. He was not a teller. His role seemed to be more administrative, handling paperwork and what appeared to be more complex transactions. He was a new face. I had not seen him on my first few visits to the area. His posture was different, too. While the other employees moved with a practiced ease, he seemed perpetually anxious, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting to the door whenever a new person entered. His suit looked too big for his frame, and he would constantly adjust his tie, a nervous tic that seemed to betray a deep-seated unease. I watched him over the course of several days. I saw him arrive at the bank precisely at 8:45 a.m., his face a mask of exhaustion. I saw him take his lunch break alone, sitting in his car and staring into the middle distance, his sandwich untouched in his lap. He was not like the others. He was an outsider in his own workplace, a thread that was loose in the intricate tapestry of the bank's daily operations. I had a hunch, a gut feeling that had served me well for a lifetime. He was my key. He was the most likely candidate for a compromised employee, an unwitting accomplice, a person who had made a mistake and was now living with the consequences. I remembered a case from my past, a fraud ring that had used a young, inexperienced clerk at a credit union to open a series of fake accounts. The clerk had been in over his head, terrified and in denial. He hadn't been a criminal. He had been a victim of his own naivety. He was the weakest link in their chain, and when I had found him, I had found my way into their entire operation. This young man at the bank had the same look in his eyes. He looked like a man who had been caught in something he didn't understand, something that was slowly consuming him. He was a perfect target for an intellectual hunter. The financial trail I had followed was a single, clean line. The money had been transferred to a closed account. But my experience told me that even a closed account left a residue, a faint but traceable scent. The person who had handled that transaction, who had opened and then closed that account, would be the most likely to have some knowledge, some small forgotten detail that would open up the case. The young man in the back corner of the bank was my best bet. He was the one who was most likely to be susceptible to pressure, to be living with a secret so heavy that a well-placed word would be enough to break him. My mind began to formulate a plan. It was not a plan of force or intimidation. It was a plan of psychological precision. I would approach him not as a detective, but as a ghost, a specter from a past he had tried to bury. I would appeal to his conscience, to the part of him that was living in a constant state of fear and anxiety. I would offer him an exit, a chance at redemption. I would show him that I knew more than he thought, and I would give him the opportunity to do the right thing. He was the thread, and I was going to pull. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythmic drumming on the roof of my car. I was no longer an old man in a cheap sedan, a victim of a cruel digital lie. I was a man of purpose, a hunter on the trail of his prey. The labyrinth was complex, and the lies were deep. But I had found my thread, my single point of entry. My heart was a stone, and my mind was a tool. The hunt was on. I was ready. My heart was a metronome, ticking with a cold and steady rhythm. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a world that glistened with an unnatural brightness, a deceptive calm that mirrored the one I carried within. I had spent days watching him, the young bank employee, a ghost in his own workplace. I had learned his routine, his habits, the subtle shifts in his body language that screamed of a man living in a state of quiet desperation. He was a puzzle piece that didn't fit, a single loose thread in a tapestry of deceit. My plan was not one of confrontation, but of precision, a surgical strike aimed at his conscience. I waited until he emerged from the bank, precisely at the end of his shift. He was a creature of habit, and his movements were a predictable, monotonous pattern. He walked to his car, a small, unassuming sedan, and sat in it for a few minutes, his hands on the steering wheel, his head bowed. I saw the exhaustion in his posture, the weight of a secret that was slowly consuming him from the inside. This was my moment. I parked my own car a few feet away, close enough to be a presence, but far enough to not feel like a threat. I got out, my movements slow and deliberate, and walked to his window. I did not knock. I simply stood there, a silent, unblinking specter from his worst nightmare. He looked up, and his eyes, when they met mine, were wide with a terror that I had anticipated. He saw an old man, a stranger, but he also saw a ghost. My face, my name, the memory of the transaction he had so carelessly handled, it all came rushing back to him in a single, gut-wrenching moment. He knew why I was there. There was no need for words. I simply looked at him, my eyes a window into the cold, calculated fury I felt. I did not speak. My silence was a tool, a form of psychological pressure that I had honed over a lifetime. I watched as he squirmed, his nervous tics becoming more pronounced. He adjusted his tie, his fingers fumbling with the knot. He looked away, then back, his gaze a panicked search for an escape route. His face, once pale, was now flushed with a deep, burning shame. He was a child, caught with his hand in the cookie jar, and I was the relentless parent who knew the truth. Finally, I spoke. My voice was low and calm, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling between us. "Your name is Daniel," I said, and his body stiffened. I had not asked a question. I had stated a fact, a confirmation that I knew more than he thought. I saw the flicker of hope in his eyes, the foolish, desperate wish that I was just another old man, lost and confused. I extinguished that hope with my next words. "You live on Elm Street. Your father is a retired carpenter. Your mother works at the local library. You have a younger sister who is a student at the University of Washington. Each fact was a bullet, each one piercing his carefully constructed wall of denial. I had not used any digital tools for this. I had simply used my old-school detective skills. A quick search of the bank's employee list, a few phone calls to local businesses, a confirmation of his address from a public records database. It was the kind of work that seemed boring and tedious, but in my hands, it was a weapon. His eyes widened, and he looked at me with a mix of fear and confusion. He was a man who had lived his life in the shadows, and now he was standing in the full glare of the light. He was no longer an accomplice. He was a victim, a man who had made a small, seemingly insignificant mistake, and was now paying the price. I saw the turmoil in his eyes, the internal battle between his fear of me and his fear of the truth. I knew I had him. "You're not a criminal, Daniel," I said, my voice as soft as a whisper. "You are a victim, just like me." My words were a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the sea of his despair. I saw the flicker of a single tear in his eye. He was a man who had been caught, and he was a man who was ready to break. I knew that he had not planned to be a part of this. He had simply been a young, impressionable man who had been used. "I know you didn't mean for this to happen," I continued, my voice a soothing murmur. "But you are a part of it. The money I transferred, the money that was taken from me, passed through your hands. The account was closed, but the ledger is not. The money went somewhere, Daniel, and I need to know where." I was offering him a choice, a chance at redemption. He could continue to live in the shadows, to be a part of a lie, or he could tell me the truth and find a way out. He shook his head, a single trembling gesture of surrender. He spoke, his voice a hoarse, broken sound. He told me everything. He had been approached by a man, a relative, who had a simple request: to open a few accounts, to handle a few transactions, to look the other way. He had been promised a small commission, a few $1,000s, a sum that had seemed like a fortune to a young man trying to make ends meet. He had been told that it was all legal, that it was a simple business transaction, that he had nothing to worry about. He had believed him, and he had paid the price. He told me the name of the man who had approached him. His name was Martin. He was the one who had orchestrated the entire operation. He was the one who had given him the instructions, the one who had promised him a piece of the pie. He was the one who had used his own nephew as a pawn in a game of deceit. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. I had my link. I had my ghost. The single small mistake that had led me to the truth. I had come seeking information, and I had found it. The young man, Daniel, was no longer a stranger. He was an accomplice who had been given a chance at redemption. A man who had helped me find my way through the labyrinth of lies. I had found my thread, and I was going to pull on it until the entire tapestry of their deceit unraveled. The hunt was no longer just about me. It was about all of us, the countless victims who had been preyed upon by this network of predators. The hunt was on, and I was closer than ever to the truth. The name was a key, a single word that had unlocked a new world of truth. Daniel's confession, a torrent of fear and regret, had given me what I needed. Martin. The name was unremarkable, a common sound in a city of millions, but in my mind, it was a name charged with the weight of a dozen different deceptions. I had come to the bank looking for a thread, and I had found the very weaver of the web. The motel room, with its stale air and its single humming light, felt less like a prison and more like a command center. The hunt had moved from the abstract to the concrete. My work began with a single keystroke. I did not search for Martin as a criminal. I searched for him as a person. My old methods were my only tools now. I began with the most public of all records, the internet. I scoured social media, a digital landscape so full of curated falsehoods that it was a perfect hunting ground for a man who had spent a lifetime looking for the subtle cracks in a facade. I found a profile with his name, a face that was both familiar and alien. It was a man in his late 50s, his features a soft echo of the young man in the bank. His eyes were not Daniel's. They were colder, more calculating. This was the man who had orchestrated the lie. I began to build a digital dossier, a detailed file of a life that was both public and private. I found his Facebook profile, a meticulous record of a life that was meant to seem prosperous and respectable. There were photos of him on a boat, a drink in his hand, a wide, empty smile on his face. There were photos of him at a golf course, his posture a study in practiced ease. I saw his friends, a small, carefully selected group of men and women who all seemed to be in the same line of work: online sales, digital marketing, all the new age professions that could be a front for anything. They were all part of the same digital community, a closed ecosystem of deceit. I cross-referenced the names in his friend list with the names that had appeared in the financial records Daniel had so fearfully provided. The names were all there, a perfect match. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. It was a network, a house of cards, each member a single fragile lie holding up the entire fraudulent structure. I was no longer hunting a single ghost. I was hunting an entire family of phantoms. My mind, a machine that had been designed for this very purpose, began to connect the dots. I saw the way they all commented on each other's posts, the inside jokes, the seemingly innocent exchanges that were, in fact, subtle signals, a coded language of deceit. My investigation moved from the public to the private. I used my old skills to access public records databases. I found his address, a suburban house in a quiet neighborhood. I found his business registrations, a series of shell corporations with names that sounded legitimate but had no physical presence. I found legal filings, a trail of lawsuits from disgruntled business partners, from angry customers, from a life built on a foundation of lies and broken promises. This was not the work of a single impulsive act of greed. This was the work of a professional, a man who had built a career on the exploitation of trust. The most disturbing part of my investigation was the discovery of the other victims. I began to search online forums and consumer complaint websites using the keywords I had identified from my own correspondence with Eleanor. I searched for widowed, charity, funding gap, romance scam. The results were a chilling, heartbreaking confirmation of my worst fears. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds, of stories just like mine. Stories of lonely people who had found love and companionship, only to have their hearts and their savings stolen. The names were different, the faces were different, but the story was always the same. I found a forum dedicated to romance scam victims. The pages were filled with testimonials, with confessions of shame and humiliation. I read their stories, and I saw my own face in their words. I saw a man who had sold his house to help a charity. I saw a woman who had given her life savings to a soldier who needed money for a medical emergency. I saw the faces of people who had been taken in by the same promises of forever and soulmates. The emotional pain in their words was a physical presence. It was a cry for help, a collective moan of a community that had been shattered by a single, cruel lie. I began to contact them. I sent them messages, not as a victim, but as a fellow investigator. My messages were brief and to the point. I offered them no promises of a miracle, only a chance to find justice. I showed them that their pain was not a result of their own foolishness, but of a professional, organized criminal enterprise. I gave them the name I had found, Martin. I watched as the responses came in, a slow trickle at first, then a flood. They were all connected. The threads of our individual tragedies were all tied to the same puppet master. The house of cards was an intricate and beautiful lie. It was built on the foundation of human loneliness, on the desperate desire for love and companionship. Each victim was a single, fragile card, and each con artist was a skilled architect, building a structure that was meant to stand for as long as it was profitable. But I was not a builder. I was a destroyer. I was a man who had spent his life tearing down the carefully constructed lies of others. My work was to find the foundation, the single weak point that would cause the entire structure to collapse. I was no longer alone in my hunt. My allies were the ghosts of the past, the men and women who had been taken in by the same cruel lie. We were a legion of victims, and we were all united by a single, burning desire for justice. We had all lost something that could never be replaced, but we had all found a new purpose. We were going to find the man who had orchestrated our pain, and we were going to make him pay. The house of cards was still standing, but I had found the single, fatal flaw in its design. The hunt was now a crusade, and I was ready to bring it to its conclusion. My mind had become a machine of cold, relentless purpose. The information I had gathered over the past weeks was not a messy collection of notes and hunches. It was a dossier, a complete and irrefutable map of their operation. I knew their names, their methods, the very architecture of their deception. The rage I had felt, the humiliation that had burned so fiercely, had cooled into something far more potent, a quiet, unshakable resolve. I was no longer a victim. I was a man of action, a man with a plan. This was the final act, the last move in a game of my own making. The first step was to create a new persona, a ghost in the machine who would lure the predator into my trap. I was an 80-year-old widower, but my new self, my digital doppelganger, was a man in his mid-70s. His name was Thomas Miller, a retired oil executive from Texas, a man with an easy smile and an even easier bank account. I chose a photograph from a stock image library, the kind of photo that looked both trustworthy and slightly melancholy, a face that hinted at a life of quiet luxury and a heart that was yearning for companionship. I wrote his profile with the same care and precision I once used to write audit reports. He was a man who loved to travel, who had a passion for collecting antique books, who was lonely, but not desperate. He was a perfect mark, a man who was the very mirror of the man I had once been. I felt a chilling sense of detachment as I constructed this digital effigy. I was not creating a new identity. I was creating a tool. I chose the words for his profile with a surgical precision, each phrase a calculated trap. I used the same keywords and emotional triggers that Eleanor had used on me. I wrote about a life of quiet solitude, a profound loss, a desire for a second chance at happiness. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I was using her own playbook against her, a macabre echo of the lies she had fed me. I was laying the bait, and I knew she would take it. I felt no satisfaction in this, only a cold sense of inevitability. The hunt had moved from the abstract to the concrete, from the ethereal world of digital ghosts to the physical world of cause and effect. My work in the motel room was a solitary, relentless pilgrimage. I worked for hours, days, turning every piece of information I had gathered into a comprehensive case file. I created a timeline of their operation, a detailed account of their victims, the methods they used, the flow of money. I compiled every piece of evidence I had, the metadata from the photographs, the IP addresses from the emails, the names of the other victims I had contacted. My work was not a product of emotion. It was a product of logic. It was a document so complete, so irrefutable, that it would leave no room for doubt. I was a man of facts, and my case was built on a foundation of undeniable truth. The next step was to contact the FBI. I was not a man who trusted bureaucracy, but I knew that this was a job that was too big for a single, aging detective. I was not seeking revenge. I was seeking justice, and justice required the full force of the law. I did not make a phone call to a random agent. I used my old contacts, the network of colleagues I had built over a lifetime. I sent a series of encrypted emails to a former colleague, a man who had always respected my work, a man who would know that my case was not the rambling of a deranged old man. My messages were brief and to the point. I gave him a summary of my findings and told him that the full dossier was waiting. I told him that the case was time-sensitive and that the target was active and dangerous. The waiting was the hardest part. I had done all I could. I had laid the trap. I had notified the authorities, and now I had to trust a system that was often slow and inefficient. I sat in my motel room, the silence a heavy blanket over me. I was a man who was used to being in control, a man who had always been the one to make the final move. But now, I was in a position of surrender. I had to wait for them to make their move. I had to wait for her to take the bait. The anxiety was a physical presence, a cold knot in my stomach. I would get up in the middle of the night and check my email, my heart pounding with a breathless anticipation. I knew that she would be on the other side of the screen, just a few clicks away, a single final move away from her own undoing. I thought about the conversation I would have with the agents. I would not tell them about my personal pain. I would not tell them about the money I had lost or the heartbreak I had endured. I would be a professional. I would give them the facts, the evidence, the names, and the dates. I would be a ghost, a witness from the shadows, a man who had turned his own tragedy into a weapon of justice. This was my last mission. I had lost a home. I had lost a fortune. I had lost my last chance at happiness. But I had not lost my dignity. I had not lost my resolve. The hunt was no longer about me. It was about the young man at the bank, a man who had been used as a pawn in a cruel game. It was about the other victims, the countless lonely souls who had been taken in by the same lie. It was about the system, the network of predators who had built their lives on the ruins of others. My life had been shattered, but I had found a way to turn the broken pieces into a weapon. I had been a victim, but I was now the one in control. The hunt was no longer a personal crusade. It was a professional, methodical mission. I was a man with a plan, a man with a purpose. The final act was about to begin. I was ready. The day was a cold, sharp blade of gray light cutting through the constant cloud cover of Seattle. I had chosen the location with meticulous care, a small, unassuming cafe a few miles from the city center, the kind of place that was filled with old men sipping coffee and students hunched over laptops. It was public enough to be safe, but anonymous enough to avoid drawing attention. The agents from the FBI were in place, their presence an unseen current in the quiet hum of the room. I had described my target to them in painstaking detail, every nuance of her face, every detail of her clothing from the photos I had spent weeks analyzing. I sat at a small table near the window, a cup of coffee steaming in my hands, and I waited. My heart, a lump of stone in my chest, beat with a slow, methodical rhythm. I was not a man of nerves. I was a man of plans, and this was the final act of a very long, very painful plan. She walked in precisely on time, a vision of false elegance that I had come to know so well. Her hair was a perfectly coiffed blonde, her eyes sparkled with a manufactured charm, and the lines on her face were a testament to a life spent perfecting a performance. She was wearing a simple, tailored black coat, the kind of coat that was meant to seem both chic and unassuming. I saw the way her eyes scanned the room, not for a potential victim, but for her prey. She was looking for a man who fit the description of Thomas Miller, a retired oil executive from Texas with an easy smile and an even easier bank account. The irony of it all was a bitter taste in my mouth. She had spent a lifetime creating a facade, a mask of beauty and grace, and I had spent the last few weeks creating one to match it. She saw me, and her face broke into a radiant smile, the kind of smile that had once been my undoing. I felt a flicker of the old him, the lonely man who had been so desperate for connection. But it was a fleeting sensation, a ghost of a memory. I was now a different person, a man of cold, hard facts. I smiled back at her, a practiced, empty gesture. She walked to my table, her movements fluid and graceful, and sat down in the chair across from me. She did not ask a question. She simply looked at me, her eyes a mirror of the empty promise of a life that would never be. Her face was a masterpiece of deceit, a canvas of lies and false promises. I saw the lines around her eyes, a testament to a life spent perfecting a performance. She was not a person. She was a creation, a finely tuned instrument of fraud. The conversation began, a well-rehearsed dance of pleasantries and feigned interest. She spoke of her life, a carefully crafted narrative of a widow who was looking for a second chance at happiness. She asked me about my life, about my travels, about my love for antique books. I answered her questions with a detached politeness, each word a single step in a grand, final performance. I was a man who had been a victim, but I was now the one in control. I watched her, a silent, unblinking observer, and I saw the small, almost imperceptible signs of a person who was not a person. The way her eyes would flicker to the door, the way her smile did not quite reach her eyes, the way her hands would rest on the table, their stillness a sign of a carefully controlled facade. She was a woman who had mastered the art of deceit, a woman who had learned to turn human emotion into a weapon. I let her talk. I let her spin her web of lies, her voice a soft, melodious sound that had once been my undoing. I listened to her with a quiet, surgical precision. I was not a man who could be fooled again. I was a man who had seen the inner workings of her mind, the dark, twisted logic of her craft. I had spent weeks deconstructing her persona, and now I was watching it in real time, a live performance of a script I had already memorized. I saw the parts where she would drop in a seemingly innocent question about my finances, the way her eyes would light up with a subtle, predatory gleam. She was a hunter, and I was her prey. But this time, the prey was armed. The moment came, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the conversation. She had asked me a question about my financial holdings, a question that was meant to be a bridge to the final con. I did not answer it. I simply looked at her, a single unblinking stare that seemed to pierce through the very armor of her deceit. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single photograph. It was a photograph of a woman who looked exactly like her, but with a different name written on the bottom. The name was Martha, and the photograph was a mugshot. It was a grainy, unforgiving portrait of a woman who was a criminal, a woman who had a record a mile long, a woman who was a fugitive from justice. I placed the photograph on the table between us. I did not say a word. I simply watched as her face, a masterpiece of artifice and grace, slowly began to crumble. Her eyes, which had been so full of manufactured charm, now filled with a cold, frantic terror. Her lips, which had been so quick to smile, were now a thin, trembling line. She looked at the photograph, then at me, and in her eyes I saw the exact moment that she realized the truth. The realization was a physical presence, a cold wave of shock that washed over her. She was no longer a beautiful, charming woman. She was a trapped animal, a desperate creature who had been caught in a snare of her own making. I watched as her mind raced, a panicked search for an escape route, a way to spin this new reality into another lie. But there was no escape. The photograph was irrefutable. The name was a fact. Her entire life, a fragile house of cards, was collapsing in a single, gut-wrenching moment. She looked around the room, a desperate, frantic search for an escape route. But there was no escape. The FBI agents, who had been watching from a distance, moved in. Their movements were a study in quiet, professional efficiency. They were a single, unified force, a wall of authority that surrounded her, cutting off every possible escape route. She looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something new in her eyes. It was not fear or panic. It was a profound, almost spiritual sense of defeat. She was a woman who had lived her life in the shadows, and now she was standing in the full glare of the light. The handcuffs were a cold, sharp click. The sound was not a triumph. It was a punctuation mark on the end of a very long, very sad story. I watched as they led her away, her head bowed in shame. Her beautiful, charming facade was gone. She was a woman who had lived a life of lies, and now her lies had become her prison. The people in the cafe watched in a stunned silence. They saw a woman who had been a stranger, and they saw her for what she was, a criminal. I felt no joy, no sense of victory. I was a man who had spent a lifetime chasing criminals, and I had always known that the end of the chase was not a triumph, but a quiet, profound emptiness. I remained in my seat, the coffee in my cup now cold and bitter. The hunt was over. The mission was complete. I had achieved justice, but I had not found peace. The man who had been a victim was gone. The man who had been a lovesick fool was gone. I was a man who had nothing left. The money was gone. The home was gone. My last chance at happiness was gone. I had won the battle, but I had lost the war. The final strike was not just against her. It was against the last vestiges of hope I had for myself. I was a man alone in a cafe, a man who had a ghost for a companion, and the taste of the coffee was a bitter reminder of a past that was gone forever. The hunt was over, and all I had to show for it was a sense of profound, all-consuming emptiness. The coffee had grown cold, a bitter, dark liquid that tasted of ash. The police cars had departed, their sirens a fading wail in the distance, and the murmuring crowd in the cafe had slowly dispersed. I remained in my chair, a solitary figure at a small table, a ghost in the midst of a city that had moved on. The final strike had been delivered, but there was no sense of triumph, no feeling of victory. There was only a profound, echoing emptiness. My mind, which had been so singularly focused on the hunt for weeks, now had no purpose. I was a machine that had completed its final task, and now I sat in silence, waiting for my own internal shutdown. The ruins had begun, but they were not just theirs. They were also mine. The days that followed were a testament to the cold, impersonal machinery of justice. My laptop, which had been my tool of vengeance, was now a tool of observation. I began to track the news, a quiet, obsessive pursuit of the public downfall of the woman who had stolen my life. The headlines, once a source of mundane information, were now a battlefield of public opinion. The story was everywhere. The local papers ran with headlines that screamed of a romance scam mastermind and a web of deceit. The national news picked up the story, and the faces of Eleanor and Martin were broadcast across the country, their names and their crimes laid bare for the world to see. I felt a grim, detached satisfaction in this public shaming. The facade of Eleanor, the charming widow, was gone. In her place was Martha, the criminal, a woman whose face was now a symbol of greed and betrayal. I watched as the digital world, the very medium she had used to build her lies, turned against her. Social media was a torrent of outrage, a public prosecutor's office that was more brutal and more unforgiving than any courtroom. I saw the comments, the vitriol, the raw, unfiltered fury of a public that had been horrified by her actions. The profiles she had so carefully constructed were now being dismantled. Her friends and her followers now saw her for what she was, a predator. I saw her life, a carefully curated digital masterpiece, turn into a ruin. Every photo, every post, every single piece of her online existence was now tainted, a monument to her deceit. She had built her life on a foundation of lies, and now that foundation was crumbling. The ruin was not just hers. I used my old skills to follow the media trail, and I found the reports on her uncle, the man I had identified as the mastermind. The headlines painted a picture of a criminal mastermind, a man who had used his own family as a pawn in a game of greed. I saw his face in the news, and I saw the quiet, predatory look in his eyes that I had only glimpsed in my initial investigation. His life, which he had so carefully crafted to seem respectable and unassuming, was now in ruins. His business registrations were being investigated, his assets were being frozen, his entire life's work was being dismantled by the methodical, unblinking eyes of the law. I had found the heart of the conspiracy, and I had watched as it had been surgically removed, leaving behind a hollow, empty shell. I also followed the stories of the other victims. The online forums, which had once been a refuge of shared shame and humiliation, were now a source of a quiet, collective vindication. The victims, who had once believed themselves to be isolated fools, now saw that their pain was part of a larger, more sinister pattern. I saw their messages, their relief, their gratitude for the justice that had been served. Their shame had been replaced with a sense of dignity, a quiet pride in knowing that their personal tragedies hadn't been in vain. They had been victims, but they had also been witnesses, and their testimonies had helped to bring down an entire criminal enterprise. Their lives were still in ruins, the money still gone, but they had found a new sense of purpose. They had found justice. But for me, the victory was a hollow one. I was a man who had won the war, but I was still alone in a cheap motel room. My house was gone. The memories of Elizabeth, once so vivid and so real, now seemed like a distant echo, a phantom limb that ached with a pain that would never go away. The money was gone. The future, the one I had so foolishly imagined with Eleanor, was gone. I had justice, but I had no peace. My life was a ruin, a desolate landscape of what-ifs and what-could-have-beens. I had spent a lifetime chasing ghosts, and now I was one of them. The justice I had sought had not brought back what was taken. It had only brought a cold, hard sense of finality. I was a man who had lived his life by the rules, a man who had believed in a world where good and evil were separated by a clear, unblinking line. But this experience had blurred those lines. It had shown me that the world was a complex, cruel place, a place where a single act of kindness could be a prelude to a devastating betrayal. My life was in ruins, but I was not defeated. I was a man who had been shattered, but I had found a way to put the pieces back together, not into a whole, but into a weapon. The hunt was over, but the ghosts of the past would always be with me. I was a man alone, but I was not empty. I was a ruin, but I was also a survivor. The sun was a warm, gentle presence on my face, a sensation I had not felt with such clarity in years. I was in a park, a vast green expanse, far from the cold, sterile walls of the motel room and the relentless, digital hum of my last few weeks. My hands, which had been so consumed with the cold, precise motion of typing on a keyboard, now rested on the smooth, weathered wood of a park bench. I watched the world go by, a simple, beautiful kaleidoscope of life that I had been too lost to see. There were children laughing, their innocent joy a sharp, poignant sound in the quiet air. There were couples holding hands, their simple, unforced intimacy a painful echo of a life that was gone forever. I was a man who had won a war, but I had no spoils of victory. I was a man who had found justice, but I had not found peace. My mind, an old machine that had been running on a single focused track for weeks, was now quiet. The hunt was over. The names, the faces, the crimes, they were all in the hands of a justice system that was now working with a methodical, unblinking efficiency. I had done my part. I had found the threads. I had found the weave. I had found the puppet masters. The public shaming of Eleanor and Martin had been a grim, hollow satisfaction. Their lives, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled into a public ruin. I had watched as their faces, once so carefully curated for public consumption, were now synonymous with deceit. Their dignity was gone. Their reputation was in tatters. They were no longer a threat. They were a lesson. But my victory had not brought back what was taken. The money was gone. The house, the final repository of my life with Elizabeth, was gone. It was not a physical absence, but a spiritual one. I had sold a part of my soul for a lie, and no amount of justice could ever bring it back. The loneliness that had driven me to that website, the profound and all-consuming emptiness that had made me so vulnerable, was still a quiet companion. I was a man who had lost his home, his savings, and his last chance at happiness. I had been a victim, but I had found a way to turn my own tragedy into a weapon, a final, definitive act of defiance. The man who had been a fool was gone. The man who had been a ghost was gone. In their place, a new man had emerged, a man who had been tempered in the crucible of his own pain. My freedom was not a physical one. It was a spiritual one. I was no longer a prisoner of my own humiliation. I had been a man who had lived his life in a constant state of shame, a man who had been so thoroughly betrayed that he had lost all sense of self-worth. But my hunt had changed me. It had reminded me of who I was. I was Arthur Hayes, a former financial crimes detective, a man of facts and logic and a quiet, unblinking determination. I had spent a lifetime seeking order in chaos, and in the most chaotic moment of my life, I had found it. I had used my mind, my skills, my principles to confront a lie that was so vast and so cruel that it threatened to consume me. And I had won. The quiet solitude of the park bench was not a symbol of my defeat. It was a testament to my strength. I was a man alone, but I was not empty. I was a man who had no one to share his life with, but I was a man who had his dignity. I had faced the darkness, I had confronted the shadows, and I had emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but whole. I was no longer a ghost haunting the corridors of a life that was gone. I was a man who was ready to live in the present, a man who was ready to face the future, whatever it may hold. My life was not a story of a tragic victim. It was a story of a survivor, a man who had lost everything but had found a way to rebuild his life on the ruins of his own despair. I closed my eyes and felt the sun on my face. The pain was still there, a quiet, persistent ache in my heart, but it was no longer a source of shame. It was a reminder of what I had overcome. My freedom was not a gift from the universe. It was something I had earned. I had fought for it with my mind, with my strength, with every single fiber of my being. And I had won. I was a man who had nothing left to lose, and in that sense, I was the most powerful man in the world. I was a man who had been broken, but I had not been defeated. I was a man who had no one, but I had my honor. And that was all that mattered.